Elizabeth.
Hello, Fearne. So lovely to see you.
So lovely to see you. Thanks so much for dropping by the Happy Place Festival in unusual circumstances, but we're still making it happen somehow. I'm so glad that you could be part of it, because when we'd originally planned to do the festival this year, you were going to be there in the flesh. So I'm glad that we can still have this chat.
I'm honestly so honoured to be part of it. Thank you. And thank you for everything that you do and the work that you put into it. And it's lovely. What a nice way to start my day, looking at your face.
Yay! Oh, well, I just really hope that people, like what we're doing and enjoy it. And there's lots of different videos to find on here. So hopefully, people will find something that they feel inspired by or fired up by. So, and I'm sure this will be one of them, because we're going to talk about something that you are an expert in and a subject matter that I'm massively curious about. And that is, of course, failure.
Yes.
You've interviewed countless people now on this topic and gained so much knowledge and I guess sort of stats in a way, because what you're doing is like collating information from different people, but about one subject. And that's where I think really interesting things are discovered. And I wonder if from that process, you've seen that there is, in fact, one fundamental reason why we are scared of failure, or not. Maybe there's multiple things.
That's such a good question. And it's so true that actually that's what I spent the last 2 years of my life doing, is listening to people about this one topic. And I once heard Brené Brown talk about that, because that's clearly what she does. She collates stories, and she did a lot of collation around shame. And it made me feel like actually what I was doing had a purpose. If Brené Brown does it, I was like, brilliant. I think the reason that we're particularly fearful of failure right now is twofold. And it's because we're living in a very specific era, which is an era of social media. Now, you and I both use social media. It can be a great platform for good, but it can also come with the disease of comparison. So we are constantly comparing what we know as our insides, because we know ourselves intimately, with the appearance of other people's outsides. And it sometimes feels as though you are only ever as good as your last Instagram post. And that has to be a perfectly filtered picture of some Buddha bowl eaten on a mountaintop while doing a perfectly executed yoga pose. And when you're not feeling great about yourself, that's really difficult. But social media also means that we all now have a voice, which can be great, but it could also imply that if you make a mistake and you sent out an ill-judged tweet or an ill-judged Instagram caption, by the next day, you could have lost your job because it could have gone viral. So at exactly the time that we're being encouraged to be our most perfect selves, we are also feeling hamstrung by the potential of shame.
Yes.
And that's where our fear lies.
It's so interesting. I'd never actually thought about how there's potentially, less risk in the fact that, obviously we're experiencing a global pandemic, but, pre this global pandemic and all of the sort of suffering that we've seen happen this year, we do live in a sort of civilized society where you can pop to the shops and buy food, and we have central heating, and actually fundamentally we are probably safer than ever. But we are more fearful of failure and going wrong because of that outside opinion. So actually failure's morphed somewhat, whereas previously, like hundreds of years ago, it might have been you didn't want to let yourself down or feel like you'd fallen short with a goal. Whereas today it's everybody else is going to call me out. Do you think that's what's accentuating it?
100%. I think cancel culture has a large part to play in this, but also just the fact that whatever you do is going to be generating so much opinion. And if you are someone who has a desire to please, which is a really nice characteristic, and if you are someone who wants people to get along and wants to make a good impression and ultimately wants to be the best version of yourself, then you can be really stymied by the weight of other people's perceptions of you. And I got to a point in my mid-30s where I just realized I couldn't live my life like that anymore. Having been raised as an inveterate people pleaser, as I think a lot of women are, to be kind of nice and pliant and to constantly think of the other person, to be kind and to do the emotional labor of, making small talk at parties and ensuring that Christmas cards are sent out, like that often still falls to women. And in my mid-30s, I just realized that I was living other people's version of what my life should be.
Yeah.
And they didn't really know me. So why was I outsourcing my happiness to lots of people who didn't really know me? And that's when my life kind of imploded, but it also expanded because of that implosion. So
because there's a sense of liberation that you can, because we all know that we're going to fail. Like that's a dead cert for all of us. From the time you're born till, the end of your life, there will be failure en masse. Like you are going to experience failure multiple times, but we still are kind of striving for that not to be the case, even though we know deep down it's an impossibility. And also I think the thing that goes hand in hand with all of us feeling a lot more fear around making a mistake because of what the repercussions could be, which they won't have been 100 years ago, is that everybody's very quick to call you out on your mistakes, which is bizarre because we should have more of an understanding that we're all going to make mistakes and there's going to be more fallout. So none of us are perfect. We're all fallible. We understand that. Yet it seems that everybody's waiting to go, oh, you just did that, or, oh, that wasn't quite right, or whatever. And that's a really tricky terrain to navigate.
Yeah, it makes you feel really trapped and stifled. And, I think it's a very interesting time that we are living through because, as you say, 100 years ago, people would still have felt a fear of failure. It might have been about slightly different things. Whereas I feel now that we're taught to believe that we must attain impossible goals. So the fact that your amazing podcast and this festival is called Happy Place, I know that's because happiness in your eyes and the eyes of all of your fantastic guests and speakers, happiness is multi-layered and multi-textured, and it encompasses lots of different things. And I think that there's been a misperception that happiness is just like the ultimate goal of life, and you will get there and you will reach a sunny plateau and everything will be fine. You'll be exactly where you want to be in your career, you'll weigh what you want to weigh, all of this sort of stuff. And it's a complete myth. And actually, what I think you and I both try and do is to bring to the forefront the fact that life is texture and that you can learn so much from failure, from sadness. That's not to say we want to go through them, but as you said, it is a fact that sadly we will. And I think the other thing that I'd like to say there is that some people are given more space to fail than others. This is not an equitable thing. And I know that I speak from a position of great privilege. I'm white, I'm middle class, I'm speaking to you on a laptop. There are people who are marginalized, people of color, Black people, as we've seen in America recently. They are not given the space to make the mistakes that the rest of us are, because it can be literally life damaging. And I just wanted to kind of acknowledge that, because I think that there are different gradations for different people. And I'm aware that because I speak from a very narrow perspective of my own, that's why I really seek to get a diversity of voices on the podcast and in my books who can speak to that range of experience.
It's so important. And I think storytelling is one of the best ways for all of us to listen and to educate ourselves. Listening is one of the most underrated things out there. And I think, you and I have talked about that a lot, how much we've learned from just listening to people's stories. And it's just so important. And I also hope that we're doing the same with the festival, that you can sit and listen back to so many people talking about their life experiences and having, dynamic stories that really differ in background, subject matter, and lessons learned is just so important. I wonder if you think that from what you've learned from listening to all of these stories, if there is always the opportunity to learn from failure, or are there some exceptions where there's nothing gained?
You know, that's such a good question. I've been thinking about this question a lot recently for various reasons. One is that we're living through a global pandemic. Another is that some stuff has happened in my personal life which has caused me a lot of grief. And a third one is that a very, very dear friend of mine at the beginning of this year went through a life-altering health issue. And it made me really think about how I talk about failure, because what it made me realize is that there are two types of failure. There's your common or garden failure, which is like failing your driving test or failing an exam or failing to get that job you wanted. And these can have massive impact on you. Like they can really make you sort of reassess what you want and who you are. But they are ones that can be more easily assimilated, and it's more obvious what lesson there is to learn from them. But then there are existential cataclysmic failures that seem to happen for absolutely no reason. And in fact, it would be really monstrous for me to sit here and say, oh, the global pandemic happened so that we can learn more about ourselves. Or, you know, my friend is this ill because it's teaching her something. That's really grotesque. So my way of looking at that is that those failures happen, and sometimes they do happen for no reason. And that's really difficult because it will shake your life to its core. But I personally choose to try and attach some kind of meaning to it subsequent to the actual failure, something that I can take from it, something that I've been taught from it, some filament of wisdom that I've gained. And in that way, I choose to make something meaningless as meaningful as I can. You know, it's not easy. And I think that with many failures, there is a process of grieving and coming to terms with it. And during that time, it is totally fine for you not to feel like you're failing well. It's fine.
Yes, of course, because, you know, we're not meant, you know, I don't think it's normal to just instantly cope with those huge situations in life. And we've had a similar situation within our family this year. And, you know, it's so hard to think, well, what is the lesson here if someone is super ill? You know, what, because you're just dealing with the day-to-day pain or practicalities of it. And I think, like you say, the most important thing there is not to beat yourself up that you're not going, right, I'm learning a lesson. What is it? You know, you're just coping. And I think it's so important to mention that. Do you think, talking about the smaller end of the scale and the more day-to-day failures that we will all experience without exception, do you think the people, because you've interviewed some renowned, you know, just astonishing, highly skilled, top of their game people, do you think they've perhaps experienced success on that level because they've been more willing to fail?
I definitely think that, because, I mean, I've watched The Last Dance on Netflix recently, as I know. I mean, the most amazing show ever.
It's the best.
I'm obsessed, as I'm sure you are. I so want to get Michael Jordan or Scottie Pippen on the podcast.
Oh, either. I would just sit there and say, right, you speak. I'm not even going to ask any questions, like in awe.
I know.
One day.
Michael Jordan is famously one of the greatest athletes of all time. And he's also someone who paid great tribute to the power of failure. He's like, I only fail if I don't take the shot. If I take the shot and I miss it, I've learned something from that, because all failure ultimately is data acquisition. And it's not just athletes who can use that. It's people who go on dates, on like online dates.
Yes.
That are, you know, awful. And the guy or girl doesn't return your text message. And you feel so sort of ashamed and embarrassed and sad about that. But what if every time that happened, the wrong person was eliminating themselves from your inquiries and bringing you a step closer to the love that was ready for you? That's the way that I choose to think of things. And I do think that the most successful people have come up with a strategy similar to that, which is, how can I not only cope with failure, but learn from every single lesson that it tells me?
Well, let's talk about the coping element, because, you know, I know you have experienced failure that has floored you. I really have. And I lost my confidence for a very, very long time. And I think I'm actually still building it up now. I'm not, you know, aiming for this complete person that's fully confident necessarily, but I'm certainly on a daily basis striving to kind of, you know, get myself to a place where I do cope better with failure, or do deal with rejection, or all of those things that we don't necessarily want in our lives. And I wonder what you've learned from your podcast and interviewing all these people about what are the best building blocks to go from feeling like ground zero back up to I can try again.
Well, first of all, I'm glad that you're not a completely confident person, because that would be horrendous.
I'm so far from it.
Your beauty and strength is in your vulnerability. And that's one of the things that I think is one of the building blocks, to realize that in sharing and being brave enough to be open about vulnerability and about the times when things in our lives don't go right or don't go according to plan, that actually paradoxically is the source of our most potent human strength, because being human is all about connection. So that's one thing I'd say. I think the other thing to be aware of is that failure is a fact. It is going to happen to all of us. No matter how hard we try to avoid it, it will still happen. And actually, once you acknowledge that, it's quite liberating, because you're in control of the emotion that you attach to it. And that's another way of saying quite a sort of famous Buddhist principle, which is that you exist separately from your worst thoughts. So you exist separately from what your anxious brain is telling you. And that was taught to me by this phenomenal man called Mo Gaudat, who's been on my times, who developed an algorithm for happiness. And one of the things that he says is that he names his brain. So he calls his brain Becky. And
brilliant.
Yeah, it's after this negative girl at his school who was always pointing out the things that would go wrong rather than the things that would go right. And he says that when he finds himself in that kind of loop of anxious narrative, internal chatter, like your brain saying, you're not good enough, you're such a failure, no one likes you, he will actually stop himself. He'll stop whatever he's doing and he will talk to Becky and he will say, Becky, what is your objective evidence for that assertion? Because if you don't have objective evidence, I would like you to take that negative thought and replace it with a positive one. And in that way, you can train your brain to cope with failure and to be happier. And then failure as data acquisition, I think, is a really powerful tool to kind of to be able to pick yourself up after something that has not gone according to plan, and to tell yourself that you have acquired necessary data about what you want, about who you are, and about your next step is a really kind of powerful thing to remind yourself of. And the last thing that I would say, sorry.
No, I want to know all of it.
The last thing that I would say is that it's very helpful to try and live your life without too much exaggerated expectation of it. So I used to be someone with 5-year plans. I used to be someone who made New Year's resolutions, which would be like, I'm going to run a marathon and learn Italian, having never jogged before and never spoken a word of Italian other than spaghetti. And I used to be someone, again, with 5-year plans, and I'd be like, I would see myself in the most amazing sort of career space. And actually what that did was it put a lot of pressure on me to go from the point of 0 to 60 in a limited space of time. And whenever I didn't achieve that impossible goal, I felt like a failure. So the idea is that you live your life without exaggerated expectations, so that you don't feel like a failure in your own eyes. Because it would turn out that when I got to that 5-year point, and I was 5 years older and wiser, I always wanted slightly different things from the things I had imagined the future version of me would want. So I now realize that actually, unless I can make a practical effort right now to invest in that kind of future notion, then there's no point, because I need to pay attention to who I am today. Like, that's who needs my attention and my focus, rather than hoping I'll be someone else in 5 years' time.
And also we're sort of kidding ourselves about the amount of control we have over our own lives, because no one was planning a pandemic. Do you know what I mean? It's like we have to kind of leave room for things to go awry and able. And going back, like, I just thought about something when you were talking about Mo there. How much of how we think about ourselves in terms of failure do you think is habitual? Because we'll probably all have a certain aspect of our lives that we feel more of a failure in than other parts. And I wonder if that is habitual rather than it being an actuality.
Yeah, I think a large part of it probably is. It's probably a sort of default mechanism that you've had from when you were 4 and someone said you weren't good at running. I seem to be talking about running a lot. That's obviously my thing. And actually that kind of embeds itself. That's why words are so unbelievably powerful, and that we should be careful about the kind of expressions that we use, particularly when we're raising children. So I think a lot of it is habitual, and it's quite useful to ask yourself, what voice does your internal critic speak in? So most of us will have that internal voice that is telling us that we're doing things wrong or that we're not good enough. Sometimes it's like a teacher who was critical of you, or a parent who said something that off the cuff that they might not have meant. And I think it's really helpful to sort of drill down into who it is who is giving you those messages, because the chances are that you will have outgrown them, and you haven't done yourself the justice of allowing yourself the space to catch up with the fact that you've outgrown them. So I think, to answer I think a lot of it is kind of outdated messaging that we give ourselves. And beyond that, even more outdated, because a lot of our brains are still hardwired from a caveman and woman era, where we were constantly scanning the horizon for saber-toothed tigers, and we were in fight or flight. And that's not appropriate, even though our brain sometimes thinks it is, all of the time.
Absolutely. And if, because I often completely understand the notion of, you have, like the Michael Jordan thing, you have to try to work out if you're going to succeed or fail, learn from that and try again. Like, you have to keep trying. But I have certainly experienced moments in my life where to try has felt almost impossible. And at times it probably has been impossible. I've thought, actually, I am going to give up on this. And thinking back, actually, I have stopped doing certain things because I haven't felt able to cope or do it and actually keep mentally healthy. And I wonder, it's something I think about so much in my own life. How much are you supposed to push yourself to try again? Are there moments where you go, actually, I'm not up for failing again or going through this pain again because it is too much for me? How do we gauge our own internal barometer on that one?
I think that's such a good and wise question. And one of the things that I would say is that knowing when to quit and quitting is not a failure. Knowing when to quit is actually another way of saying that you know and respect yourself. You know and respect yourself enough to make that decision, as much pain as it might cause you. And for me, the process of starting the podcast and doing what I do has been a process of really getting to know myself. And I now realize that I was not pretending, but I was definitely trying to be someone who I thought was better than who I actually was inside for a really, really long time. And a lot of that was because I found myself in situations where I felt intimidated. I was a staff feature writer on a national newspaper at a really young age, and I didn't feel good enough, and I didn't feel serious enough, and I didn't feel clever enough. And so I would always try and project something. And actually that made me feel uncomfortable with myself for a really long time. And the podcast has been such a great gift because it's made me realize that people respond to me most when I'm being most authentic. And so when you are living an authentic life, I think that gives you so much more space for tuning into your instinct, out of the kind of white noise, like really being able to feel what your gut wants you to feel. And women particularly have been very discouraged for doing that for millennia. And the reason we've been discouraged is because it is extremely powerful. And it's beyond rational logic, but sometimes, in fact, all times, your gut is telling you something that you need to know. So that's what I would say, is that you secretly do know when you need to quit, but sometimes you don't want to admit it to yourself. And I've often had that in dysfunctional romantic relationships. It has always taken me quite a long time to end them or to have them end on me. And that's been because I sort of knew, but I didn't want to admit it to myself. So I think you need to be really honest with yourself.
It's so true. I mean, I've certainly had it with work a lot of the time. And what I've had to almost do, I've almost been forced to by the circumstance or how I have been mentally feeling, is usually like leave said job that I feel I can't deal with anymore because of the repercussions of teeny bits of failure in my career because you could stutter a word and be ridiculed or something minuscule. And that felt like too much pressure in some parts of my career. And then I have certainly had the whole internal rumination of, you know, am I a failure? You know, am I worse at coping than other people? But then I think through time, I've managed to reframe it and actually get to that gut feeling a bit later down the line and gone, oh no, that was perhaps intuition or an inner knowing of that wasn't right. So I don't think it has to be necessarily instant or the right way round. I certainly learned it down the line, which has still been a relief because it's heavy to sit with a feeling that you failed at something, you know, when you perhaps didn't, and it was just not right for you. So I think that's a comfort for a lot of people that will find themselves in that situation of feeling like, oh, how come everybody else did this or got to there or managed that and I didn't? It's not about failure. It's much more about what's right for you. And that's, I think, a comforting thing to realize.
Totally. And I think the other lie that we're told is that age somehow diminishes us. And it doesn't. That has not been my experience, and it has not been yours, because actually age gives you wisdom, whether you want it or not. Like, life will just teach you these lessons, and sometimes life will keep sending you the same lesson until you finally learn it. And that was definitely the case for me in terms of romantic relationships. Like, I kept making similar mistakes until I finally got it. And there's no shame. I mean, sometimes I wish that I'd learned it more quickly, but actually, because it took me that long, I think I've learned it deeply. So there are different ways of gaining knowledge and different gradations of that knowledge. And one of the things that I always think is amazing about you is that you were so young when you were famous and doing live TV, which is one of the most stressful environments anyone can be in. And being that young in an industry that really cherishes youth, particularly in women, it denies you that wisdom that you get with age. And that's just a horrible, toxic combination. And I think that you navigate.
It is. I mean, you might think that, Elizabeth. I certainly have a very different take on it. But I think, you know, that was certainly one of those things for me of outgrowing things and ideas and realizing it rather than feeling like a failure. You know, I think later down the line, I certainly have felt less drawn to doing, say, entertainment TV or the stuff that I was previously known for. And I did feel like a failure for a long time because there's great change. And I think a lot of the time that's confusing for our brains to digest and to process. But I think, you know, again, like society tells us that being, you know, big and shiny and everything looking perfect or being on TV equals success, but that doesn't equate to me anymore. You know, success is, for me, friends in my life that nobody else necessarily knows about, but they're doing what they love and they're doing it really well. I would rather be like that than the stuff that society tells us is success, but is sort of vapid and empty. So I think, again, it's just kind of myth busting a lot of the time, isn't it? Myth busting your way through life.
Totally. And for me, success is now truly knowing myself.
Yeah.
and honoring space to allow myself to be that authentic self. She said using self 5,000 times. Success is finding another word for self. I think you're right that change is terrifying. I mean, change and transition are areas that I feel really uncomfortable in because I like to feel safe. And part of my feeling safe is having routine and knowing where things are, both practically and kind of internally, and having a home. Like those are things that are really important to me. But I think what the pandemic has taught many of us and what the lockdown has taught many of us is that we are actually, as humans, really able to respond to change in a very impressive way. We adapt very quickly. As hard as it might seem, we have, most of us, all been able to do that. And I think that that's a really wonderful lesson to take from it, that we are adaptable and we are more resilient than we think.
I completely agree. And yeah, you know, just the courage of people that we've seen who have either, you know, lost family members to it or working on that front line at the NHS, you know, we've been able to witness some amazing resilience, and that's been, you know, very inspiring indeed.
I just come in there, actually, it's like, sorry, just before you, but that's such an interesting point, because those heroes are people that operate a lot of the time behind the scenes. It's been really wonderful to give them their moment. But that is, I mean, no one would argue that what they do is a form of extraordinary success and an act of real service. And yet that's not normally what society heralds as success. And so I think that's a perfect example of the fact that success is not what we've been told it is.
Oh my God, completely. That's one of the things that I have found frustrating for a long time, but not been able to pinpoint it in the right direction, I guess, because, you know, I think modern day society does still really over celebrate some pretty odd, empty stuff, like what people look like, what they're wearing, what their Instagram feed looks like, and numbers on Instagram meaning something weird that we've got used to that. Whereas, as you say, you've got people who are doing work that is truly meaningful, impactful, life-changing, yet completely uncelebrated until 2020. Yeah. There's something vastly wrong with all of that. And I think, you know, hopefully we're moving in the right direction to change that very incrementally and slowly. And lockdown's been a good chance for us to shift our focus somewhat and look at people that are doing extremely meaningful work. But we've still got a long way to go.
We do. But spaces like this that you have created, I think, enable us to get a bit further along that road. So thank you so much.
Oh God, I mean, I'm doing a teeny thing, but hopefully it will really, you know, give people some interesting stories to listen to, which is, as we've said, is one of the most important thing right now, listening to different voices talk about their lives and their experiences. Elizabeth, thank you so much for being part of this today. I love you, and I'll see you soon.
I love you too, and thank you for asking me. It's been a delight.